Hello, welcome to Rocky Railway Bible Adventures Day 2, where we're learning that Jesus' power pulls us through. On Day 1, we learned about Jesus' power helps us do hard things. And our story was from the book of Acts of the Apostles, which is the book that follows the Gospels in the New Testament of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then is Acts. And as I told you, it is the part of the Bible that tells what happened to the believers in Jesus after his death, resurrection from the dead, and appearance to many, and then his ascending to heaven. And so the members of the early church had a really rough time. They were in a small minority. They were few in number. In the city of Jerusalem, particularly, they were very small in number out of the 200,000 people who supposedly lived there in that area at that time. So our story was from the book of Acts chapter 9, and we followed Saul, who had been a Jewish man who disliked and wanted to punish and imprison and kill believers in Jesus, to being a Jesus follower, following his being spoken to by Jesus and on the road to Damascus, and he was stricken blind, and he became to believe that Jesus truly is the Son of God and is the Christ. So following his conversion, there was a complete change in attitude of the Jewish leaders. They went from encouraging Paul to arrest and imprison believers in Christ to seeking Paul out to do the same thing, to imprison him and put him in jail. So Saul spent years traveling around teaching people about Christ, and he was imprisoned many times. He was beaten, and but he was adamant in his telling about who Jesus really is. So our story, we are fast forwarding to much closer to the end of Acts. We're going to be in Acts chapter 27. And at this point in our story, Saul is now called by his Roman name of Paul. He is a Jewish man, but he is a Roman citizen, and at birth he was given both a Jewish name and a Roman name. He was given the Jewish name of Saul, and he was given the Roman name of Paul. And he uses Paul because he is talking to people who are non-Jewish people. Jesus was a Jew. His early followers were Jews. The early believers in him as Christ and Jesus as the Christ were Jews. But Jesus called Paul to go speak to Gentiles, and those are people who are non-Jews, like me, like most of you. And we are not Jewish people because we were not born as a Jewish person. So Saul is going by the name of Paul, and he has been put on trial, and he has been arrested, he's been beaten, he's been put in prison, and now it's decided in our story today that he is going to plead his case. He's going to have a trial in front of Caesar, who is the ruler of all of the Roman Empire. And so in our story, we're going to pick up with chapter 27 of Acts, and I'm going to be going through it. You all may join me in your Bibles or just follow along with me as I tell you about this. And I'm going to be reading from the book of Acts, but I'm also going to be skipping some parts because there's some names that are hard to pronounce and really are not completely relative to our story today. So in the beginning of our story, Paul is going to be put on a ship to go to Rome. And he's heading out sometime in early November, which is not the ideal for sailing on the open sea, the Mediterranean Sea. The good times to sail are from June through May through October, easily June through September. And this is probably early November. And the reason they didn't sail later than those months of June through September or October is that the winds, and it's very, very prone to bad storms in the Mediterranean. So he comes upon a terrible storm, and we're going to read about that in chapter 27 of Acts. When it was determined that we were to sail to Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were placed in the custody of a centurion named Julius of the imperial company. Now, a centurion is a Roman soldier, and he is in charge of 100 soldiers. So he's getting on a ship with this Julius, who is a Roman person with 100 soldiers, and Paul and some other prisoners are getting on board this ship. We boarded the ship, and it was about to set sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia. So we put out to sea. The next day we landed at another port, and Julius treated Paul kindly and permitted him to go to some friends so that they could take care of him. As I told you, Paul had been in prison. The prisons were not nice back then at all. Not that any prison is nice, but he was not treated well, and he'd been beaten, and he needed medical attention. So this Julius was a kind centurion, and he allowed him to be helped by some friends that he had where the ship landed. From there, we sailed off. We passed Cyprus, using the island to shelter us from the headwinds. We sailed across the open sea, and we landed in Lycia. And there the centurion found the Alexandrian ship headed for Italy, and he put us on board. After many days of slow and difficult sailing, we arrived off the coast of Sindus. This is one of those names I don't know how to pronounce. The wind wouldn't allow us to go farther, so we sailed under the shelter of Crete, and we sailed along the coast only with difficulty until we came to a place called Good Harbors. Well, much of the time there had been lost, and so the voyage was now dangerous since it was so late in the year. Paul warned them, and he said, "Men, I see that our voyage will suffer damage and great loss, not only for the cargo in the ship, but also for our lives." But the centurion, persuaded more by the ship's pilot and captain than by Paul's advice, said the harbor was not suitable for spending the winter there, and that the majority supported the plan to put out to sea from there. They thought they might reach Crete and spend the winter in its harbor because it was a much safer place for them to spend the winter. So there was a gentle south wind, and it began to blow, and they thought they could carry out their plans, and they pulled up anchor and sailed closely to the coast. Before long, a hurricane-strength wind swept down from Crete, and the ship was caught in the storm and couldn't be turned into the wind. In other words, if they were going to sail safely, they had to face the wind and ride the waves that way. After sailing under the shelter of an island, we were able to control the lifeboat only with difficulty. They were battered by the violent storm over the next day, and the men began throwing cargo overboard to lighten the load on the ship. And when they didn't have, neither sun nor moon appeared for many days, and the raging storm continued to pound us, all hope of our being saved from this peril or this danger faded. For a long time, no one had eaten. Paul stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have complied with my instructions not to sail from Crete. Then we would have avoided this damage and loss. Now I urge you to be encouraged. Not one of your lives will be lost, though we will lose the ship. Last night, an angel from the God to whom I belong and whom I worship stood beside me." Now, the Romans didn't believe in angels. They had all kinds of gods, but they didn't believe in angels. And so he says, "Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar." In other words, Jesus, want you to have your time to talk about me in front of the ruler of the Roman Empire. God has also graciously given you everyone sailing with you your life. And be encouraged, men. I have faith in God that it will be exactly as he told me. However, we must run aground on some island. So on the 14th night, they had been weathering this storm for 2 weeks. They were being carried out across the Adriatic Sea. Around midnight, the sailors began to suspect that land was near. Now remember, these were very experienced sailors, and they knew the signs of land, that they were close. So the sailors, though, thought they were going to crash and that they would all die. And so they planned to take the lifeboat and get away. So Paul said to the centurion and his soldiers, he said, unless they stay in the ship, you can't be saved from this danger. In other words, we need these sailors to get us in as close as possible so that we can be saved from this sinking ship. The soldiers then cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. They weren't going to let those sailors get away. Just before daybreak, Paul urged everyone to eat. He said, this is the 14th day since you've lived in suspense and you've not even had a bite to eat. I urge you to take some food. Your health depends on it. None of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said these things, he took bread, he gave thanks to God in front of them all, then broke it and began to eat. Everyone was encouraged and took some food. In all, there were 226 of us on the ship. When they had eaten as much as they could and wanted, they lightened the load by throwing the grain into the sea. They were trying to make this ship sit higher in the water so that it could get closer to shore before it crashed on the rocks. In the morning light, they saw a bay with a sandy beach. They didn't know what land it was, but they thought they might possibly be able to run the ship aground. They raised the foresail to catch the wind and made for the beach. But they struck a sandbar and the ship ran aground. The bow was stuck and wouldn't move, and the stern was broken into pieces by the force of the waves. The soldiers decided to kill the passengers to keep them from swimming to shore and escaping. There was a Roman law that said that if a soldier allowed a prisoner to escape, even if he didn't try to let the prisoner escape, he would be put to death in punishment for losing that prisoner. And so they wanted to kill the prisoners so that they wouldn't get killed themselves. However, the centurion wanted to save Paul, so he stopped them from carrying out their plan. He ordered that those who could swim, they were to jump overboard first and head for the land. And he ordered the rest of them to grab hold of planks or debris from the ship, and in this way, everyone reached land safely. All were saved. Only the boat was lost, just as Paul had told them, as the angel had told Paul in a dream. We too feel powerless at times. Like with this virus, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't want anybody to get sick. We want to stay well ourselves. We're powerless. But knowing and believing in Jesus gives us hope. Jesus' power gives us hope.